Now, let's transition into talking about the modern return of the Nephilim in our day and in the future. Remember I mentioned earlier about the 70 generations, the watchers were judged, bound, and buried for 70 generations? Well, that comes from this text right here in Enoch chapter 10, verse 12. And when their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated. 70 generations. Psalm 90, verse 10, defines a generation as 70 years, 80 if by strength. So, let's just do a little simple math. 70 times 70 is 4,900 years. If my calculations were correct earlier, 4,900 years away from 3000 BC brings you to the beginning of the 20th century. Think about the 20th century. We went from basically a flat line, beasts of burden, horse and buggy, for 6,000 years, to planes, trains, automobiles, supposedly putting a man on the moon, sending space shuttles around the Earth. We have the International Space Station up there, the Hubble Space Telescope, looking to the farthest reaches of the universe, space probes leaving our solar system. All that in less than 100 years? How do we go from a flat line for 6,000 years to that massive explosion of technology and science and transportation and everything? I mean, I'm going to suggest maybe that the watchers have been released or are in the process of being released. At the fulfillment of Enoch chapter 10, verse 12, we're seeing it happening in our day. So I'm going to talk about a few things. I mean, we probably spent all day long talking about things that happened in the 20th century, but a few really caught my attention. This one most recently caught my attention. The creature from Jekyll Island. In 1910, the Federal Reserve was created. Right? It was conceived in 1910. This is a quote from G. Edward Griffin, who wrote a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island. He says, the Federal Reserve is a hybrid organization. It is a partnership between the federal government and the private banks. When you look at it deeper than that, its essence is neither as a government agency nor a private company. In reality, it is a cartel. And he goes on to expose it. Well, this is an interesting connection that I recently stumbled upon related to the things that we've just been talking about and looking at. Notice that G. Edward Griffin says that the Federal Reserve is a hybrid organization. He didn't mean this the way that I'm looking at it right now, but I doubt that he knows how true that statement actually was. After the last Future Congress conference, it was a big conference we just had here in Dallas in January, I met a man named Tim Bentz. And Tim had experience in finding and destroying Nephilim altars in the Middle East. He'd find these Canaanite altars that were being dug up in different places in the Middle East. And the Bible says destroy those things, tear those things down. And God has called him to do that, to go and wage spiritual warfare, hardcore spiritual warfare against these ancient demonic sites and structures. And I recently had him on my radio show, and you might definitely want to check out, it's a 2-part radio interview that I did with Tim Bentz. If you go to blogtalkradio.com, blogtalkradio.com/revolutionary radio, and just scroll down and you'll see it's one of the featured episodes. It was called Canaanite Altars and the Federal Reserve. You definitely want to listen to that one. He told me that after dealing with some pretty hardcore spiritual warfare in the Middle East, that the Lord actually called him to go to Jekyll Island, which is where the Federal Reserve was conceived. He went and learned something very interesting about the Fed. He discovered that the buildings that were now there now, were built over an American Indian village. But this was no ordinary American Indian village or tribe. While there, he met a guy who was in charge of a museum on the island, and I'm just going to play a clip from that interview. This is what happened when he met this individual from the museum. At this time, when he first got there to Jekyll Island, he didn't know. He's like, Lord, why am I here? Why are you bringing me to Jekyll Island? And then he found out why the Lord brought him there.
He takes me back to the museum, and he said, we got a lot of stuff on the Indians. He said this was actually like the government main community for a tribe of Indians that don't exist anymore. That tribe was called the Timucas. He said the Jekyll Island Club was actually built on top of everything that the Indians had. So they just kind of wiped the village out and built a club on top of it. So wherever the chief's house was, there was a cottage now. Wherever the council house was, there was now the Jekyll Island Hotel. You know? And he said everything that's built and visible today is actually sitting right on top of something that was significant in the Indian village when it existed. You know? And so I said, well, let's look at the museum. I want to see some of the Indian stuff. So we're looking at arrowheads and spear tips. And he said, you want to see the bones? And I said, well, yeah. That sounds, don't get to see a skeleton very often. I said, are they where we can actually see them, or are they buried? He said, no, they're visible. So they had a burial site that they had been very respectful for when they built the museum. When they found a burial site, they didn't move the bones. They left them where they were. And so I'm looking at 4 skeletons of the Timucua chiefs. And I realized, man, these guys are really tall. And I commented to the guy that, how tall are these guys? They look unusually large. And he said, yeah, they're all about 8 or 8.5 foot tall. He said all the Timucuas were unusually tall, even the women. And he said, oh, by the way, I've got a painting that actually shows the Indians. I said, well, I'd like to see that painting then. So he pulls that out. I'm looking at it, and it shows the Indians and all their regalia, and they're dancing around and having some kind of a ceremony. And then I see an altar, and it looks a whole lot like the one that I had dealt with in the Middle East. And I'm looking at the picture, and I'm going, is this an altar? Is this stone like something they're sacrificing on? Because this guy's holding babies in his hands in this picture. He said, yeah, they're cutting those babies, they're hacking those babies up in that painting. And so when you look at the detail, 2 of the shamans or chiefs are holding a baby up by the ankles, and they're whacking their heads off and spilling the blood on this altar. Mm. And I'm like, sir, I don't want to be disrespectful of your training and archaeological understanding and history, but I don't know of any native tribe that did what I'm seeing here unless it was an act of war. And this is really, really unusual. And I've seen this type of scene with artifacts over in the Middle East. And I've seen weapons like this over in the Middle East. Well, he was quite interested in that because he loves Native American history, but he's starting to question, maybe I need to dig into this more. That was his comment. So I said, at that point, then I thought, I believe this is why I'm here. I needed to see this and hear about this. At this point, I'm not that concerned about the financial stuff anymore. I'm wanting to know where is this altar. And so I asked him, I said, can you take me to this altar? He said, I can take you to the altar, but you can't see it. And I said, why can't I see it? Is it buried? He said, no, it's not buried, but it has a house built on top of it. I said, who would be crazy enough to build their house on top of a blood sacrifice altar? He said, well, Rockefeller was. So nice. We go over there, and he's got the keys, though. So we go into the house, and he takes me into the parlor. He said, you're standing right on top of the altar right now. This is the room that is built on top of it.
Now, this parlor, that's where those guys, J.P. Morgan and all those guys, actually conceived of the Federal Reserve, right? Right over that altar.
That's exactly right. It's the room that they were sitting in when they drew up the entire legislation and plan to pass it that became the Federal Reserve Act.
Wow.
So this was the conception of the Federal Reserve banking system on the parlor sitting on top of a blood sacrifice altar.
You wonder why our banking system and our monetary system is so corrupt? It was literally conceived over a Canaanite blood altar. And Rockefeller put his house right on top of it, and the parlor where the whole thing was conceived of was right above the blood altar. The Federal Reserve. Talk about a creature from Jekyll Island. G. Edward Griffin, I don't think even knows about that. But his title for his book was appropriate for sure. Let's move along. In the 1900s, we have an individual here named Aleister Crowley. In January through March of 1918, famed occultist Aleister Crowley began a series of magical experiments called the Amelantra workings, in which he is said to have opened a portal to another dimension, allowing an entity, or a demon, I believe, named Lamb to enter through it. This is 1918, okay? And this is the drawing that Crowley made of the creature named Lamb in 1918. It looks curiously similar to the alien grays of pop culture today. He created a portal through which, an interdimensional portal through which this creature entered. Then in 1946, something else happened called the Babylon working. Supposedly, Crowley's portal was further enlarged by Jet Propulsion Laboratory founder and rocket fuel scientist Jack Parsons and Scientology and Dianetics founder L. Ron Hubbard in March of 1946 at a location that later became known as Area 51. Their experiment was called the Babylon working. Like the Amelantra working, it was based on ceremonial sex magic. Unlike Crowley, however, they were not as adept at opening and closing portals. Theirs apparently stayed open, and the modern UFO era began 1 year later, the same year Crowley died, 1947. And of course, that leads us to this location right here, Roswell, New Mexico. Now, that's not the actual place that the alleged crash took place. It apparently happened further to the northwest. Roswell was just the closest city where they came and reported it. I mentioned earlier David Flynn. He went out there with a team of researchers, I think it was in 2005, with some GPS equipment and stuff, and they determined that the location where the crash took place was at 33.33 degrees north latitude, and when they calculated, they multiplied that location by the universal constant of pi, it gave them the longitude 104 of where they were standing. And I talked about this at some length in my Mount Herman Roswell connection DVD, so you might want to check that out, going into more detail on the connection between Mount Herman and everything that took place in the Genesis 6 experiment and what happened in 1947 and has continued to this day. How many of you have ever heard of this book right here, the Urantia book? Anybody? Well, a couple people. It's not something many people are very familiar with. The Urantia book originated in Chicago sometime between 1924 and 1955. The authorship remains unverified. The authors introduced the word Urantia as the name of the planet Earth and are portrayed as superhuman personalities delivering a series of revelations meant to, get this, correct the errors and omissions of the Bible. It's a very dangerous book. I'm actually convinced it's probably the most evil book on the planet. And the reason is because first of all, it's a 2,000-page thick book. This is it right here. It's a very thick, large book. It's got those Bible-type pages, really thin pages. A lot of information in this book. A lot of it may be true. There was a lot of things in here that were scientific, that were not known at the time it was written, that were later discovered, that seemed to validate some of the things in it. But, you know, how many of you know that even if it's 99% true, it's that 1% that will kill you? Right? The 1% of rat poison that's inserted in there. You know, where they take off and go off the biblical page and start saying stuff that actually contradicts the Bible, you know, with all the convincing stuff that's in there, when they throw in that seed of doubt, that's very bad. It's poison. The Urantia Foundation is a U.S.-based nonprofit group, first published the Urantia book in 1955. That's when it became available to the public. But it was in existence prior to 1955 in certain circles, many think in circles of government. And we have in 1952, from July 12th through July 29th, there was a rash of UFO sightings in the skies over our nation's capital. You could look this up if you're not familiar with it. A very interesting UFO flap took place right over our Capitol building in 1952. And that prompted the creation of Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book. Okay, when this book first came out, it didn't have the fancy cover you see up there on the PowerPoint. This is the way it came out. Okay, Project Blue Book, which started in 1952, was one of a series of systematic studies of UFOs conducted by the U.S. Air Force. The first two projects were called Project Sign and Grudge.